Today I'm going to be busting, debunking, destroying some myths about thru hiking the Pacific Crest Trail. Now, for those of you that don't know, I thru hiked most of the Pacific Crest Trail this year. I did about 2,200 miles of the 2,600 miles. I'm now gonna leave an opportunity for those of you that wanna make fun of me for not finishing to leave your comments. Ready? Go. Now that that's out of the way, you could call some of these things myths, I guess. You could call them misconceptions. A lot of these are based on things that I thought were gonna be true about thru hiking the PCT that I discovered were not true. And starting off with myth number one, and this is that the desert, you know that desert section for like the first 700 miles of the PCT? Turns out it's not all just like total barren wasteland desert kind of vibes. Does that make sense? I guess what I mean by that is going into the PCT, I thought that the desert section, that first 700 miles from the Mexican border up to where the Sierra starts at Kennedy Meadows South, I thought that section of the trail was literally gonna be like no tree cover ever, just brown, just like I said, completely barren. And that's not true. It is true that most of that section is kind of just a barren wasteland, but that's an exaggeration. There's some really cool stuff in the desert. I don't know, I thought that tree cover would be very rare. I thought that certainly there would be no sections of like miles where there's trees, where you're in the forest. I thought you're in the desert, how could you be in the forest? Turns out that's not true. There are a few stretches every now and then where you're actually hiking through the forest and you're actually in the trees, and it was really, really refreshing and it felt really, really good. Just as a few examples, the first one that comes to mind was when I was leaving Idlewild, California and hiking into the San Jacinto section of the trail. This is pretty early on in the trail. I think it's like less than 200 miles into the trail. I'll put the number up, I can't exactly remember. What I do remember though is at first when you're hiking out of Idlewild, it is pretty deserty, but as you get up higher and higher and higher in elevation, eventually you get into some forest and you stay in that forest for a good chunk of that section. When I was up there, it really reminded me of Colorado, and I remember turning to my hiking partner Flossie and just being like, what are these trees? We were both really surprised that we had a solid, like, I don't know, day and a half of mostly tree cover. And again, it makes sense because you're up really high in that section. I believe that's the highest you are that far into the PCT. And it was really nice. And then of course, we eventually just descended for 20 miles straight all the way back down to, what was that town? It's where the In-N-Out is. It's where we went into Beaumont, but there's another town. All right, we're just gonna redo this. And then all of a sudden the trees came to an abrupt end when we descended for 20 miles straight and just were immediately dropped right back into the desert. So it does change really, really fast, but there are sections in the desert that actually have trees and don't really feel like a desert. The next myth that I'm gonna freaking just bust, don't clip that. I'm gonna freaking just bust. This one also has to do with the desert, and this myth is that the desert is just nothing but heat all the time. And I know this one depends a little bit on your start date. I'm sure it's probably not a secret that if you start early, say like March, early April or something like that, it's gonna be pretty chilly at times. You're even gonna be hiking through snow at times. But I started in mid-May. I started on May 15th, and I was under the impression that the desert was just gonna be hot as shit, like a fresh pile of shit, the entire time that we were going through there because of our late start date. And it definitely was really, really hot. And I would even say the majority of the time it was pretty damn hot. But that did not stop the PCT from throwing a number of really cold nights and even a couple days at us. And this was really surprising to me because again, I thought like desert, you know, beginning of summer, it's gotta be really hot all the time. And that just wasn't the case. You can tell I'm all bundled up, man. Yesterday it was literally probably close to 100 degrees in the middle of the day. And then here we are just over 24 hours later and it's freezing cold. It's probably gonna be the coldest night so far. And one thing that's really funny and kind of ironic is that between the towns of Acton and Tehachapi, California, right in the heart of the desert, it was getting so hot that we actually ended up flipping our sleep schedules and hiking at night. We did this for a few days, and during a few of those night hikes, it got cold as shit. So here we are, we totally messed up our sleep schedules. It was hard to eat, just adjusting to the night shift as we called it was really, really difficult. And we're in the middle of this because we were trying to avoid the heat. and now we're freezing cold. And so we were just like, what the fuck are we doing? You just can't win. And in particular, I remember the section where we hiked from Hiker Town overnight to the town of Tehachapi. And that overnight section on the LA Aqueduct, which is known as one of the hottest, if not the hottest sections of the entire PCT. We were going through this infamous hot section and it was freezing cold. That was one of the only sections of the PCT where I hiked with my down jacket on. Very, very ironic that we were avoiding the hottest section of the trail by hiking at night and then ended up freezing cold. The next myth also has to do with weather, and that is that I have a bug, this itches, ow. This myth is that it never rains on the PCT. Now, this might be a bit of an exaggeration because I know there are a lot of people that know that it rains on the PCT. And the reason I know this is because in one of my pre-PCT videos, I made a comment about how we're probably not gonna get rained on at all. And then a bunch of you guys just absolutely on me in the comments for it. And those commenters were right. It does in fact rain on the PCT sometimes. However, I will say that it doesn't rain very much at all. In fact, I'm sure there have been a few hikers who have hiked the entire thing without seeing any rain. It certainly still does rain on the PCT. I remember the last night that Flossie and I spent in the desert, we woke up just a few miles south of Kennedy Meadows and it started raining at like 6 in the morning. And I remember eventually when we did get out and the rain kind of stopped, we were looking at each other like, how ironic is it that we've hiked through so much sun and desert and gotten tan as because it's not supposed to rain in the desert, right? And then literally our last night on the freaking desert section of the PCT, we got rained on. Just as a last middle finger to us as we left the desert behind and entered the Sierra. And speaking of the Sierra, it can definitely rain in the Sierra as well. In fact, we even got hailed on in the Sierra at the base of Mount Whitney the night before we climbed it. And then on top of all that, the probably most obvious part of the PCT that can get some rain is northern Washington. We did not see any rain in Washington, although we also didn't finish Washington. So you can in fact get rain on the PCT, and the important takeaway for this point is just to simply be prepared for it. Even though it's not gonna happen very much at all, you should still be prepared for it. Make sure you have like a waterproof lining inside your pack, like a trash compactor bag or Nylofoam. Make sure you have a rain jacket. Make sure you just keep your stuff dry, or you have a way of keeping your stuff dry, even though it's probably not gonna rain that much. It still can, and you might get f***ed. Before I get into this next myth, I just wanna say that you should go check out the Patreon, patreon.com/KyleHatesHiking. I have totally revamped my Patreon. I'm going hard on Patreon. For instance, a few weeks ago, I uploaded a video of a wrap, an ultralight wrap that Flossie and I had been working on a few years ago.
I get so much sex in my dude that she's impressed because she loves the cushion on my thermal rest.
So if you want a little bit of extra content and you just want to, most importantly, support this content, please go check out patreon.com/KyleHatesHiking. Okay, the next myth about through hiking the PCT, and this one drives me bananas. This myth is that you have to send a bunch of resupply boxes in order to resupply properly on the PCT. It's not true. Now, to be clear, there definitely are a few different resupply points where you're gonna want a box. So I'm not saying you don't have to send any the entire trail, which on the Appalachian Trail, you pretty much don't. There's definitely a few spots on the PCT where it's gonna be in your best interest to send a resupply box. However, these spots are very few and far between. I feel like a lot of PCT hikers that I met on the trail, a lot of people are under the impression that you have to send resupply boxes to a bunch of different spots on the PCT, and that's just not true. The vast majority of the trail, you can go into town and you can resupply at a grocery store or some sort of general store and be totally fine. Even a lot of the spots that people recommend you send boxes, most of the time you could still get away without a box there. You probably will have to be a little bit pickier and a little bit more open-minded about what food you buy. Ice cream and coffee for breakfast, and for Phoenix SpaghettiOs. Wanna buy it? Nope. But in most of these spots, you could still do it. Now, like I said, I do remember a few spots in Washington where you pretty much had to send a resupply box, like Stehekin, I think, although again, I didn't make it that far. But if you're planning a PCT hike right now and you're like stressing out, like trying to figure out like all these resupply boxes, don't stress out about it. You should definitely research it because like I said, there are a few spots, but I only sent 2 resupply boxes before I left for the PCT, and they were literally my first and third resupply. And I didn't worry about sending any boxes after that all the way up until I got to the Washington border. In fact, if you go on halfwayanywhere.com and read a bunch of their surveys where they interview PCT hikers after their hikes, you'll find that those surveys, those studies, you could call them, consistently show that PCT hikers wish they sent less resupply boxes during their through hikes. This next myth is that the PCT is never steep. And I'll be honest, I think this one probably is mostly something that I believe coming from the East Coast, coming from an Appalachian Trail through hike, coming from tons of hiking in really steep, rugged terrain. I was under the impression, and I think a lot of people believe this as well, comment if you believe this, I was under the impression that the PCT was just gonna be a smooth cakewalk. And I will say, for the most part, that is true. Like, mile for mile, the PCT is definitely less steep, less aggressive than the Appalachian Trail. But I remember distinctly, there was a few times on the PCT where it was steep as shit, and I just wasn't ready for it. I remember specifically there was a section in Yosemite National Park where it was very reminiscent of the AT, at least in terms of the grade and stuff. It was just like steep up, steep down, steep up, steep down. In the Sierra, there's definitely some steep sections. And then another really gnarly steep section I remember was literally the last section of the PCT that I hiked. It was like 70-ish miles, and Brandon and I did it in 3 days, and holy shit. It was an ass kicker, man. It was super steep, tons of climbing, tons of descending. It was probably the hardest 70 miles of the whole trail for me. And I just remember thinking like, man, this is not the smooth cakewalk that I thought the PCT was supposed to be. And of course that's an exaggeration, but just don't be fooled if you've already hiked the Appalachian Trail, or if you're used to hiking in like the White Mountains or somewhere that has really steep terrain. Like, yes, the PCT is generally gonna be easier than that stuff, but there's still gonna be some steep sections, and you gotta be ready for them. Let's get this channel to 50,000 subscribers. Hit that subscribe button if you haven't done so already. And if you have, I love you. Thank you so much. Leave a comment letting me know that you subscribed. I will pin the best one. And take care, everybody.